I am stunned that we have Scotty back for the first time in 3 years and we got someone he could dance to. Welcome back. All right. So, there has been a resurgence of book bans this year and last year. I think at the Ethical Society we agree that reading and learning and tolerance and free thought help individuals and our community be more welcoming and more inclusive, and for people to bring out their best. We cannot have book banning in our schools, in our libraries, or our society. We want people to think for themselves and develop open minds. So that's my theme today. Now, when I raised my children, I didn't want them to do as I say. Well, some days I did, actually. But most generally, I wanted them to do as their mind and their heart guided them to do. I want them to nurture critical thinking skills and compassion. I didn't want to raise sheep that just followed the flock. I wanted them to learn as much as they could about different perspectives so they could create their own individual, unique path in life. That's what the free-thinking philosopher Daniel Dennett made a point of years ago in his book, Breaking the Spell. Dennett argued for compulsory education about religion in all schools. He said, quote, "Let's get more education about religion into our schools, not less. We should teach our children the creeds and customs, the prohibitions and rituals, the texts and music. And when we cover the history of religion, we should include both the positive, the role of the church in the civil rights movement of the 60s, the flourishing of science and the arts in early Islam, the role of black Muslims in bringing hope, honor, and self-respect to otherwise shattered lives of many inmates in our prisons, for instance, and the negative, the Inquisition, anti-Semitism over the ages, the role of the Catholic Church in spreading AIDS through Africa by resisting the distribution of condoms. No religion should be favored and none ignored," end quote. Now this makes sense to me, as does Dennett's warning. If you have to hoodwink or blindfold your children to ensure they will confirm their faith when they're adults, your faith ought to go extinct. Dennett added, by opening the minds of all young people and giving them a shared store of mutual knowledge about all religions, they protect all those minds from the toxic forms of religion that spring up in every tradition. And that's the spirit behind the Tree of Knowledge in our lobby that Margaret Downey and the Free Thought Society brought to us over a decade ago. We display on that tree many books that are considered heretical by traditional religions, but we also display books from those same religions that are revered, like the Torah, the Bible, the Quran. Because at the Ethical Society, we're not afraid of open minds, and we certainly don't want to blindfold anyone making this their humanist community. But today, people are fighting for blindfolds. Given this resurgence of book bans, let's do a little history first. Control of information has always been a thing in society, but it really began after the printing press proliferated in 14th century Europe. Before then, the most powerful institution, the church, could control distribution because monks could only make a limited number of manuscripts. Should any heretical literature escape from the monks' circulation into the society, you could always do a little book burning, like happened on February 7th, 1479, when the original bonfires of the Vanities illuminated the public square of Florence, Italy. Once books became more available, ecclesiastic authorities looked for more systematic ways of banning. In 1529, the list of prohibited books was first published. Over centuries, it blacklisted thousands of book titles and publications. The faithful were forbidden to read Johannes Kepler, Immanuel Kant, among others. Curiously, actually, some books that you'd think would get on the list didn't, like Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species or Hitler's Mein Kampf. They didn't make it onto the list. But the final edition of the list was published in 1948, and it was officially abolished in 1966. Of course, there were powerful forces other than the church that dabbled in censorship. In the United States, Anthony Comstock of the New York Society for Suppression of Vice used the taxpayer-funded Postal Service to restrict what he considered obscene, like birth control information, right? What amazed me was in the 1873 symbol for this Society for the Suppression of Vice, they chose to include in the original logo a depiction of book burning. I mean, there was no, clearly they knew what they wanted to do. Now, Comstock drew on a long line of book burning tradition, such as in the Spanish Inquisition. In 1499, Cardinal Cisneros burned works that dared to focus on human beings instead of on God. In 1562, Spanish friars, frustrated at their vain attempts to convert the indigenous, burned all the Mayan writings that they could find. Tragic loss to us. The German poet Heinrich Heine spoke with foreboding in 1821 about the burning of the Muslim holy book, the Quran. He noted how ink and blood often run together. Quote, "Where books burn, so too they will in the end burn human beings." So it shouldn't have been much of a surprise when the Nazis slid from burning books to burning bodies. And it's awfully ironic that today, Art Spiegelman's graphic novel, Maus, about the Holocaust, is a target for censorship, and in Nashville, some of his books were burned. Spiegelman understood that some people might have a visceral reaction to his book. After all, he commented, quote, "This is disturbing imagery, but you know what? It's disturbing history." Now, given the ironic horror of book-burning books about the Holocaust and the rest of the hysteria around all of this, sometimes people turn to parody. Betsy shared with me how Margaret Atwood, to defend open minds, worked with Penguin Random House to publish The Unburnable Book. It's a copy of The Handmaid's Tale made from flame-resistant paper and flame-retardant cover. So check out the video of her. There's the cover of the Handmaid's Tale that Betsy brought in today. Check out the video of her using a flamethrower, this octogenarian, on the Handmaid's Tale. Drew will try to pull it up for us. The money was done. Pen America. I'll talk about that. So it seems incredible to me that the horror of Nazi mind control, after that occurred and the Holocaust that it stimulated, that people in the United States were still burning books. But as the Cold War heated up, book burning came back again in the 50s, banning libraries from holding classics like J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye or Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. And into the 70s, the banning continued, and into the 80s as well. Toni Morrison had her books, The Bluest Eye and Beloved, both banned. And the historian Harvey Graff wrote that the book banning movements are rooted in counter-Reformation efforts of the Catholic Church to attack theological radicals. Now, this has always been an emotional issue, but it's really most about power. Graff saw similarities between today's book banning and 500 years ago. He said, quote, "Both movements are inseparable from ignorance, rooted in fear and expressed in both legal and extra-legal struggles for control and power. Both are inextricably linked to other efforts to restrict free speech, choice and control over one's body, political and civil rights, public protests, and more." Now, Graff points out one obvious fact, and that is that this issue is being manipulated by politicians, particularly, but not exclusively, by right-wing politicians. Extremism is really brandished in a way as a sign of being tough. Intolerance seems to sell well. Last March, for example, members of the Idaho House passed Bill, get this, 666, that would lead to the arrest of librarians for allowing patrons to check out books that some believed were harmful. Thankfully, the Senate of Idaho did not take up that bill. Now, Texas seems particularly drawn to book banning, as my good friend Carolyn Parker, who is the executive director of the AAU, might say, surprise, surprise, right? Texas is there. She lives in Austin and is constantly bemoaning the fact that she's in a blue dot surrounded by intolerance. But Governor Abbott in Texas called for criminal charges against any school staff providing students with young adult books that he deemed were pornographic. Republican State Representative Matt Krause targeted 850 books in Texas that touched on race or sexuality that might, quote, make students feel uncomfortable. Many of the books are being challenged for causing discomfort because they mention LGBTQ people or immigrants, strangers, right? Last year, as women's reproductive rights was going to the chopping block, it was no surprise that The Handmaid's Tale was taken out of Texas schools as well. Now, this is a national trend. According to the American Library Association, there's a 60% increase in book challenges from last year. PEN America, this group that promotes freedom of the press and fights censorship, documented that between July 1st, 2021 and March 31st, 2022, Texas banned 1,145 individual books, more than any other state. With number 2 on that list, the second most banning state, you know which one it was? Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania. So while book banning has been a big issue for publishers and public libraries, it's really recently that schools are the main battlefield for this. PEN America said that during the last full school year, 140 school districts in 32 states banned more than 2,500 books in those states. Today, there are these self-appointed censors that are not content, though, with banning specific books, because the preferred trend these days is to ban complete themes or topics or demographic groups. That's how they aim the bans now. Issues concerning sex and race are the main targets. The Washington Post reported that most books are banned because they involve sex, abortion, teen pregnancy, puberty, LGBTQ topics or characters, race, racism, protagonists of color, and the history of black people. Now, back in the 70s and 80s, the banning having to do with anything that was related to non-heteronormative sexuality or orientation was the attacks were primarily led by Anita Bryant against keeping gay teachers out of the classroom. These days, it's about keeping gay books out of the classroom. Some people said that the recent victories for people from the LGBTQ plus community, like marriage equality, which is also beginning to be challenged, has triggered this backlash. Now, authors who happen to be both gender non-normative and a person of color are primed most for being banned, and this was very clear to George M. Johnson, who wrote about his experience growing up a queer black man in his book, All Boys Aren't Blue. It's the second most banned book in the United States, banned from 28 school districts across the country. And the historian Graff notes that one unique aspect of the current bans compared to the past is this, that in the past, the book banners actually had read most of the books that they wanted banned. Graff writes that the people behind these movements in the past prided themselves on their direct familiarity with the explicit contents of the books they wished to ban or even burn. They used their literacy in the brazen efforts to control the uses of others' literacy, end quote. But today, many of the critics have never actually read the books they wanted banned. In this way, Graff says, the, quote, new illiterates are achieving a rare historical distinction. Now, personally, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the term, the new illiterates. It sounds elitist, overly harsh. And despite my frustration over censorship, I don't like to throw blanket insults about groups of people. You see how well it worked when Hillary Clinton used the term the deplorables, right? But I grant Professor Graff some cred and the right to give that term because he's the founding director of Ohio State's Literacy Studies program, and he wrote a book called The Legacies of Literacy, one of the most respected books on the topic. And he's concerned about a broad reactionary movement that's holding up illiteracy as a virtue. Now, to better understand this movement, I want to explore briefly why people ban books. Now, especially ones that they don't bother to read, right? Well, Nancy Snyder, who's a journalist and a writer, counsels against seeking logical or rational reasons for these bans, because she says that they're really rooted in fear. Fear of others, fear of difference, fear of change, fear of suffering. Some of it's rooted in shame or religious doctrines of sin, which are really the roots of most campaigns based on obscenity charges. Now, there's plenty of legal ground, by the way, for outright bans of works that are considered obscene. Courts have granted localities and states the power to ban those books. And the ruling in 1973, many of you know, is Miller versus California, said that a work can be considered obscene if it, one, lacks serious literary, artistic, or political or scientific value, if it's patently offensive according to state law, and if it's deemed by the community to appeal to prurient, lustful interests. Now, we can debate whether the Miller test is a good one or not, but it does give book banners their most powerful legal tool in a way. But I think the emotional element most at play in today's book banning, which is focused on schools, is parental fears concerning their children. Now, few things will activate mama and papa bears more than perceived threats to their children. Some parents fear that their children are not ready to process some issues in a healthy fashion. Some argue not for complete bans, but for assurance that the material taught to children is age appropriate, quote unquote. And that's a legitimate concern. I think that needs much more discussion. And teachers and administrators do discuss it. And I think we need to bring people into that discussion to try to come to some common ground. But many censoring parents seem most afraid that exposure to certain works will push their children to adopt alternative genders, orientations, or lifestyles, and that then they will become the victim of bullying. Now, I empathize with that impulse to spare our children pain. I understand why some parents might want to blindfold them about identities and behavior that they think may make them a target. But there are better ways to protect our children than to tell them to stay in the closet and develop self-loathing, which happens so often. But perhaps the most pernicious part of parental fear involves a long-standing narrative that people outside of the sexual mainstream are predatory groomers, a term we're reading a lot more about. This narrative is weaponized by parents frightened who have few relationships with openly LGBTQ people. It's used today, as it has been used before, to stoke hatred and further marginalize gay, lesbian, queer, trans people, and so on. At the same time, many of these parents don't provide any room to discuss issues of sexuality and orientation. And many young people are given few avenues to find out about these topics and about themselves. I read about a young adult novel by Emily Danforth titled The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which was taken off of Delaware's summer reading list because one parent complained that the book was a roadmap . Well, before concluding what I think we need to do regarding book banning, I want to mention the fact that it often backfires, right? So I wonder, how big of a problem is it really? Should we just let the banners do what they want? Because I doubt the Vatican was aware that when they started to publish their list of prohibited books, it became a guide for people to find the books on the list. Oh, what's banned this year? I don't think the Nazis actually got any books out of existence, despite all their efforts. But it did inspire French anti-fascists to create the Library of Banned Books, right? And today, the best way to increase book sales is to ban it. The fatwa against Salman Rushdie for writing satanic verses led his book sales to soar. When the McMinnville, Tennessee School Board took the graphic novel Mouse out of the schools, it became Spiegelman's anthology called The Complete Mouse went to #1 on Amazon's bestseller list. And when Toni Morrison's Beloved was questioned by Governor Youngkin of Virginia as to whether it should be taught in school, it rocketed to the bestseller list as well. I mean, Barnes & Noble right across the street has events around banned books and displays around banned books. And their webpage has a page dedicated to banned books. You can get puzzles, book covers, book bags. I don't know if you can get banned book ties. I got this elsewhere. But clearly, it's something that is banning often backfires in that way. So given that, it's not surprising that books which are banned these years, which are mainly about race and sexuality, they also increase sales. In 2021, one of the most challenged books in the nation was Maya Koba's Genderqueer, and it doubled its sales. Johnson, who was the author of All Boys Aren't Blue, said that attacks on his work helped marginalized queer youth. He told ABC News, "It's been bittersweet to see our stories attacked in this way, but it's also amplifying many of our stories. And I'm able to get the book out to teen readers who really need it the most. If there's anything I'm thankful for, it's that it's actually getting into the hands of the people who need to read it to heal." Sometimes book banning boomerangs in ironic fashion. Recently, a Texas conservative book banning crusade led the school district to pull off of its shelves the Bible. Well, it is full of sex and violence, right? Lots of begetting and smiting, right? So sometimes book banning has this ridiculous effect. And if it really backfires, I wonder, should we just let them do it? The answer I'm going to say, though, is no, because the book banning movements, the rhetoric used in that spills beyond the book banning movement into society at harm as a whole and leads to harm people in society as well. Regardless of what happens to book sales, book banning often stimulates increased harassment. This has been talked about by GLAAD, which is a LGBTQ media advocacy organization. It reported that book banning is just one arm of an organized campaign to target and harass LGBTQ youth nationwide. CNN reported on that the social media that we have now allows people who are victims of this to be targeted as individuals much more easily. So in the past, when you would only be found maybe on the playground when there's not a teacher watching, now it can happen 24 hours a day. And some people say that it has contributed to higher suicide rates by LGBTQ youth. And also, book banning is a problem for the overworked and underpaid teachers and administrators in this country. I mean, they're already stretched so thin, and to have to deal with intolerant book banners only burdens them further. Because they can have their promotions withheld, they can be fired if they don't follow the regulations about banning certain books, if they become a target in the eyes of their parents. So, what do we do to promote tolerance, inclusion, open minds? Well, why not run for public office? Anybody here want to do that? Anybody at home? You run from it, run right. Well, that may be wise, but people who want to ban books are running for public office on that platform. So that's why I say it's dangerous. So if you don't want to run for the state house, try the PTA, try school boards where the fight really is coming out. At least promote candidates who will assure that your library stocks a wide selection of books and that schools resist bigotry. You can also write to authors who are being banned and offer them support. You can support groups or activists fighting for open minds, like one organization in Texas, which is called Freedom Fighters, but it's spelled Fighters, Freedom Fighters. It's founded by Texas school librarians who want to uphold intellectual freedom. This year, the American Library Association gave them an award for using Twitter to highlight positive books and invited families, authors, librarians, and teens to join them, and they suddenly had 6,000 followers. So they continue to create weekly actions to emphasize the right to access to information for school library users. There's another Texas group, I like this one, called Band Camp. Band Camp. It's a summer-long camp sponsored by the Austin Public Libraries. Their director, Roosevelt Weeks, highlights, quote, that this week is about the importance of the freedom to read and why Austin Public Libraries stand against censorship and book banning. So there's an ally for you, Carolyn, down in Austin, Texas. Or you could support groups that do this nationally. I gave a donation this week to PEN America, that group that stands at the intersection of the written word and human rights. It has a web presence and a rapid letter writing program that protects free speech and the unhindered dissemination of information. Or you can join the American Library Association, which sees librarians as being on the forefront of the battle against banning. I mean, you can actually go and get the ALA's Library Bill of Rights. They have a Library Bill of Rights and get it posted in your library. It says such things like, books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all the people of the community, and that materials should not be excluded because of their origin or background, views of their contributing authors. The materials should not be proscribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. And it declares that libraries should challenge censorship in the fulfillment of their responsibility to provide information and enlightenment. One of the hardest pieces of work that we can do is try to educate other parents about how they are often being manipulated and deceived by political voices that are creating false threats and creates fear and intolerance. You can educate yourself about this, participate in Banned Book Week, which occurs in September every year. You could host a book discussion about your favorite banned book. Kate Esposito wanted to read a banned book on the corner of Rittenhouse. We might still do that, Kate. Read an entire book out there. We'll have rotating readers. You can be the eyes and ears of the banning movement, because quite often censors get away with book banning because people just shrug and say, oh, we can't do anything about these situations. According to the American Library Association, the vast majority of book banning is never reported, almost 95% of them. If you find out that a school or a library or public institution is attempting to ban a book in your community, shine some light on it, make it known. Or you can do what the title of my talk today promotes. Be an educated consumer activist this holiday season. Give your grandchildren Gail Pittman's This Day in June about a gay pride parade, or give Christopher Paul Curtis The Watsons Go to Birmingham about a trip into Alabama in 1963, or give your sister the banned classic To Kill a Mockingbird, give your uncle Of Mice and Men. There are banned books for all styles, and everybody can get one on your holiday list. So I want to end today by admitting that resisting book bans needs to be an equal opportunity effort, because while much of the media is focusing on the much more common trend of conservative book banning, progressives are guilty of it at times as well. Two Democratic state legislatures over in New Jersey lobbied in 2019 for people to stop teaching Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn due to its racist language. The Washington Post reported that liberal parents lobbied for banning To Kill a Mockingbird and Of Mice and Men because of the same sort of thing and the addition of white savior characters. This is a conversation we have to have, not books that need to be banned. So as we defend libraries from those who want to narrow our thinking rather than opening our minds, let's remember that every worthwhile library has a book to outrage everyone. I'm sure there's a book there you would be outraged was available. Bad ideas need to be countered with better ideas. Now that, of course, will require of all of us intellectual rigor, respectful dialogue, tolerance, patient, and deep compassion for one another. But I think that's the price that we have to pay to assure that we nurture open minds through literacy. So happy reading, everybody. Be well.
Thank you, Hugh.